Hello and welcome to another edition of WaveLab Workflows. My name is Justin Perkins, and today we're going to be talking about mastering a single song using the audio montage, and I'll show some advantages of using the montage. I know I did one last year, but some things have changed since WaveLab 11, such as, well, some things I'll show you about. I know that some people use just the audio editor to do single songs, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just going to explain why I do it a different way and maybe open your eyes to some other ways of working, or for those that are new to WaveLab, helping you get a jump start on that. We're going to get started pretty quickly here. Thanks for letting me know it's coming through loud and clear. I produced these myself, which there's not much production involved, so if there's ever any issues, please let me know. I did want to mention that Steinberg is doing a promotion for WaveLab and SpectraLayers Pro and WaveLab Pro. I don't know how many are left, but they originally had 100 seats or licenses for WaveLab Pro and SpectraLayers Pro for the price of one. So basically $500 US. You get both programs. That's a really, really good deal. WaveLab is great, of course, for mastering and sound design and all those things. WaveLab does have some spectral editing built in it, but also SpectraLayers is really specializes in spectral editing. So it's a great value. So if you haven't heard about that, it's a great time to get into WaveLab and SpectraLayers for some spectral editing and mastering. They go hand in hand. I'm going to show you a little bit how they go hand in hand today, because you can send audio from the WaveLab Montage to really any external editor, whether it's SpectraLayers or RX or SoundForge. Obviously, Steinberg develops SpectraLayers, so we like to use that, but it is open to any other editor. So I'll show you some of that. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. I try to check in on the questions as things are going, and then I try to do a Q&A at the very end if there's any other general questions. But otherwise, we're going to get into the single song mastering process. Now, I have a template, and for those that follow my templates and stuff like that, it's all available at wavelabhelp.com. And I did update it somewhat recently for some metadata tweaks that we'll talk about in this live stream. Just kind of some behind the scenes metadata stuff. And also, I've started with my single song template. I've just been putting a reference track in there right away. You know, I made these templates before WaveLab had reference tracks, so I found myself adding a reference track for most projects, but I do it so often I thought, why not just, make it part of the template now? So you'll see that in the new single song template and all sorts of stuff like that. So SpectraLayers versus RX, to be honest with you, I haven't had much time to get into SpectraLayers. I just have too much mastering work going on and these kinds of things. From the demos I've seen of SpectraLayers, it looks really impressive. I would love to migrate over to it sometime. I think, it's a super powerful app. I can't think of anything, that SpectraLayers can't do that RX does and things like that. So if you're looking to get into a more powerful spectral editor, now is definitely the time to get WaveLab Pro and SpectraLayers. There's no upgrade for existing users. This is just strictly for new purchases, but you get a license for each one. It's a really good deal. Going on for a little bit yet. Again, mastering bundle. If you go to the Steinberg website, you'll easily find it and can purchase it. So, but yeah, I don't have too much to say about the differences. I mean, they're just different programs. They essentially do the same thing. Spectral editing is great for removing unwanted noises in the audio, whether it's clicks and pops, chair squeaks, background sounds that weren't meant to be there, all sorts of stuff you can remove with spectral editing. And I find myself doing a lot of that these days in mastering, because as we make the songs louder and mastering and more clear, something that wasn't really a problem before tends to be pretty noticeable, once it's you start mastering it. So things can kind of crawl out of the woodwork. So spectral editing, I consider it part of the mastering job now. I mean, it's very rare when I don't find at least a couple things to remove with a spectral editor, and mastering sometimes it's a lot of things. It really just depends on the project. So all that said, let's get started. I have a template for single songs. So if I do this, I got to get in WaveLab. For me, it's Control 5, and that opens up a new montage at 96 kilohertz. And it's designed for single songs for a few reasons. One of them is the CD wizard is already preset to no quantize. And it's set to no quantize because sometimes we master multiple versions of a single in one project. You know, the main version, the instrumental, the clean version, the TV mix, all, you know, so sometimes we have more than one file. I'm going to start with one version, but I'll build up to it with instrumentals and go from there. But the reason I don't want it to quantize is I'm going to create markers for either the one version or multiples. But unlike when I'm doing an album or an EP, I don't want the markers to quantize to the nearest CD frame, because a lot of times I want these versions to remain the exact same length. You know, if you're working with a good mix engineer, all their versions are going to be the exact same length down to the millisecond and perfectly in sync. So that really makes everyone's life easier. So anyways, the big difference between my templates is that the single one is set to no quantize by default. And there's a little bit of metadata differences that we'll get into, because the name of the release is taken from the song title rather than the project title, which gets a little nerdy, but we'll get into that. So anyways, this is my layout. You'll see track 1 is going to be the main track where I put the audio. And the track below it with the R is the reference track. You can put anything you want on the reference track. It could be the unmastered mix. It could be the mix engineer's reference version, the heated reference, whatever they do to get it louder for the client to approve, but oftentimes remove for mastering. It can be a totally different song that the client likes. It could be a previous song that you mastered for the client that they were happy with, but now you're doing another single. And pretty much these days, when you're doing singles for clients, you can kind of assume that eventually they're going to end up on an EP or album together, usually. Not always, but you may want to load in that previous song that you've done for them so you can get a feel for how loud that one was and the tonality and stuff like that. So, like I said, this is already in my template now. Now I have a monitor controller with many digital inputs, so you can see mine's pre-routed to outputs 3 and 4, let's say, of my interface, so that instead of listening to the reference track right in WaveLab, I can toggle it on my monitor controller. And as you can see, I have 2 paths. I could make more, but I wouldn't need more than 2 reference paths usually. So if you have a nice interface and monitor controller, you can set these reference tracks up to be feeding your monitor controller, and you can compare it right on the monitor controller. Or if you have a simple setup or don't want to deal with that, you can listen to the reference track by pressing the listen button. So that's how I like to lay it out. I do like to make it a little smaller. I couldn't figure out how to get that saved in the template. So if you can use my template, you can create your own. To do it the slow way, you would go to File, New, Audio Montage, and then you can see your list of templates here, and you could just select it that way. Because as you can see, I also have an 88.2 kilohertz single template. The only difference is the sample rate down here in the lower right. And of course, there's nothing stopping you from using the 96 kilohertz template and then just clicking here and changing it to whatever it needs to be. I like to work at 96 kilohertz. So if things come in at 48K or 44.1, I upsample it. If things come in at 88.2 or higher, I work at that native sample rate and work my way down, which I'll show you. Upsampling is a little bit of a controversial topic, but I feel like, of course, the upsampling alone does not make it sound better, but I do think that working in a high-resolution environment does typically sound better. So, and we're going to be just doing an in-the-box master today with just plugins and no hardware. So as you can see, the cursor is, because of my template, set to 0. It's at the 0-second mark. It's waiting for me to load in a file. I have a shortcut, which is Command I. If you're using the factory shortcuts, I believe it was Shift Command I. I shortened it to Command I because we do it so often. And then I'm going to navigate to the folder. For now, we're just going to master the single song. I'm going to ignore the instrumental, but something that you should be aware of is how I lay out my folders, because it helps you do things within WaveLab a lot easier. If you have, we're going to call this band name today the WaveLabs. The single is called Linger Long, and I have a folder for the original files. These are the files from the client. The main version, instrumental, their artwork, their loud reference version. I've upsampled the main and instrumental to a new folder, and these are the files I'm going to work from. So without repeating too much from past videos, WaveLab doesn't copy the files in for you unless it has to do a sample rate conversion. But typically speaking, you need to organize and manage your folder structure before you even really get started, because you can make a mess if you don't. So it kind of forces you to be disciplined and organized with your files. So that being said, I'm going to load in to the audio montage the main mix. And it went to the reference track because I had that selected because I was showing you guys some stuff. The main mix. Now, the first thing I do is I like to save the montage. And I'm going to show you the difference between the editor and montage in a second, but let's get this saved. Command S brings up this window. And here's what I was talking about with your folder structure. It's very easy to just copy the band name. Copy in this case, the single name, or what would be the album title. And that's how I name my montages, because we're working in a 64-bit float environment, and it's a 96K environment. It's the digital master. It's version 1. Underscore means it's the master montage with all the plugins and effects. And I already closed the window, but you'll see that it did save it. It knows to save it in the same folder that the files came from. So that's really handy for workflow. So up here it says audio montage. The montage is a non-destructive environment, much like a DAW, such as Cubase or Pro Tools or Logic. WaveLab does have an audio editor. I'm going to open the song in the audio editor. This is a destructive environment. You'll see it says audio editor. I can delete stuff. I can do a lot of things, but it's destructive to the file. And one reason I don't do singles in the audio editor is because, as you can see with this file, it's cropped really tight. Sometimes you have to trim dead space from the start. Sometimes you have to add some digital silence before the downbeat. In this case, we're going to have to add a little bit because it starts too tight for my taste. But you have to do that. You have to manually add the time. And I can already see the email from the client saying, can we do a little different? So doing it in the montage makes it very easy to undo and fine tune and things like that. Whereas the editor is a little more destructive. And also, you notice there's nowhere to insert effects in the audio editor except for the master section. And as you may know, the master section needs to be saved and loaded separately from the file for the most part. So for me, it doesn't work very well to have to remember to load and save the correct plugin chain for every song. And you can also accidentally be saving that plugin chain in a random folder that you may not be able to back up or think to back up when you change computers or redo your operating system. A lot can go wrong. I don't care for using the audio editor other than for listening and analyzing files. So back to the montage. This lets us move things around freely and non-destructively. So back to my point about the start of the song. There's no rule or right answer here, but in my opinion, this starts too abruptly. Especially if you think this isn't going to CD, but back in the day of the CD, we usually wanted maybe around 200 milliseconds before the start of the song or the track and the first downbeat. It's a little different if songs have a gradual fade in. You can get away with less because the fade in acts as a buffer. But for the most part, this is a nice strong downbeat. So I like to move it. I'm going to just say 200 milliseconds to keep it simple. But what you can do is just hit play and listen. And does it feel too abrupt? Does it feel right? You kind of want to bake in a little bit of digital silence, because even some media players will have a struggle with with an intro that's that tight. Now, if you're doing samples, library production music, something that has to be tight, then that's how you would do it. But if this is going to be something released on streaming and eventually physical media, you may want to add some time. And again, in the audio editor, you can do it, but it's just directly adding it to the file. With this, I have free reign here. And while you can slide it around, it's really nice to just go to the clips tab and type in 200 milliseconds. And now I have this file starting right at 200 milliseconds. And I'm not going to play any audio today because I don't have the rights to this and it's complicated setup. But just to prevent any ticks or pops or weirdness, I'm going to do a very slight fade into this. Now I'm holding, I'm actually just clicking. The first node on a clip doesn't let you drag it up and down because it wants you to, it doesn't want to accidentally change stuff. If you hold Command, you can change the level too. We're not going to change the level, but just wanted to mention it. But I'm just going to add a very quick fade into that so that when I start adding effects or do anything, there's no tick or pop there. Now, the end of the song has a lot of dead space, and there's no right answer to this either, but you just kind of listen and decide when you've had enough of this trail. Your instinct should tell you, let's just say that this sounds good, and we can add a little fade to the end of it so it has a nice, smooth ending to the song instead of a hard cutoff. I see a lot of files come in from mix engineers that just have a hard cutoff. So I think sometimes people don't pay close attention to how the file actually ends. Is there too much dead air at the end? Does it cut off in the middle of the note and cause a tick or a pop? Part of our job as mastering is doing the heads and tails of the songs. What as unexciting as that could be to some people, that is part of the job. So right now, this 200 milliseconds doesn't mean much, but I am going to add markers so that when we make this a mastered file, it's going to start from 0, have this little bit of buffer time. And again, maybe 100 would be fine. It depends on the style of music. Like for classical music, I might do up to half a second between the start of the track and the first note. It depends on the style of music, how the song starts, any number of things, but it's something you should be at least aware of. So now we have the song nicely trimmed up. Now I like to use the CD wizard to get some markers in. Now, even though we're not making CDs, the CD wizard is helpful for a lot of things. So I have a shortcut called Control-C, brings up the CD wizard. And as I showed you earlier, I'm using no quantize, which does matter because when I hit this, you're going to see the marker is at the very end of the file and nothing more. If I had quantize enabled, it would be offset to the nearest CD frame, which may or may not be a big deal, but it comes in, again, more handy when you have multiple versions and you're trying to keep them the exact same length. Now, we do have to go and manage the first marker ourselves. And I can just drag it over to 0. I do have a little shortcut for move multiple markers. And in this case, we want to use no quantize. This is not memorized with your template, unfortunately, but I can move this back 200 milliseconds, and now that's at 0. This marker didn't move because it's an end marker. And now if we go to the markers tab, we can see that the actual song starts at 0 seconds and ends at that time. And if we go to the front, it's got a nice little buffer before the downbeat. So that's kind of some administrative stuff I like to get out of the way right away. The other administrative thing I like to get out of the way is the metadata. And metadata in WaveLab is basically generated from CD text. So I'm going to say CD text, even though it's very unlikely you'll make a CD master of this. But and I know I'm going kind of quickly, but the CD tab, the CD wizard is in here. It's this button. I have shortcuts for all these. And I also have Stream Deck commands to do it even faster. I'll try not to go too fast, though. But we're going to call up the CD text editor, which is this CD but icon with a T next to it. But what I like to do with my Stream Deck is, I'll try to explain what it's doing, but I can copy the name of my session, right? Because that has the correct artist name and song title. Open that CD text editor and paste it in to get started. So I just pressed my button there, it brings it up for me. And then what I do is delete everything that is not the title. Then I paste in and delete everything that's not the performer name. I use this button to copy the artist name of the album over to the track. And then I use, in this case, we need to copy the title into the title field, because if I pressed this button over here like I normally do, it's going to name it based on that marker, which is named not correctly. So to name that correctly, I pressed Option R, and watch how that marker name just changed from the name of the original file to just the name of the song title, which is what we want. Now there is, again, the slow way to do it, which is in the Markers tab, Functions, I believe it's called, actually it could be in the CD tab because it's backwards, CD tab, Functions, rename CD track as CD text, and that does the same thing. But basically we want to get that marker name to be exactly the song title, because that's going to affect our metadata and file naming. So now that the administrative work is done, well, the last thing we could do, which is kind of common, is ISRC codes. Let me grab a random code here and show you how to enter it. Grab that one. You can go to the CD tab and paste it in. If you're doing multiple versions of a song, you can reopen the CD wizard, go to ISRC only, and paste in the first code, and it will increment them up by 1 digit, however you want to do it. But bottom line is I did add the code. You know, some people really want to make sure the codes are embedded in the files, especially for music licensing and future proofing. You know, if you're just speaking of digital distribution on DistroKid or CD Baby, the metadata honestly doesn't matter because they don't read any of that. You have to manually enter that information when you upload it, the file, and set up the release. But I think it's great to embed that metadata for the future because who knows? If you have the information, why not put it in there? It's very easy. It makes everything complete. When your client asks if you've added the ISRC, you can simply just say, yes, I've added it. They'll find out later how useful that is. It depends on what they're actually doing, but point is, may as well add it if you can. So now, once the project is set up, this is when we get into some actual audio work. I like to start out by normalizing the song to a certain level. And the reason I do that is because I have some effects chains that are kind of already dialed in from a gain staging standpoint to how I like to work. You know, I could put some effects on this song and get it to pretty close loudness of where it's going to end up. Of course, I listen to it and do a lot of fine tuning and make sure everything that I'm doing is absolutely needed. But it gets me in the ballpark really quickly instead of fighting. You know, you get some mixes that come in that are so super quiet. You get some mixes that come in kind of loud. You get mixes coming in at all over the place. And you can fight that. And that's one way of working. But I like to, and it comes in really handy when you're doing an album or an EP, but even for singles, because of my fixed kind of effects chain, I like to normalize the song first. And the nice thing about WaveLab, it has the meta normalizer, and you can choose any level you like. You can make your own effects chain that's sort of preset in terms of gain staging and all that stuff. But the nice thing about it is it's applying this gain change non-destructively, so it didn't make a new file or anything. It's a clean way of doing it. It's not duplicating files or making a mess. It's not truncating any bit depth. All it's doing is if you go in the Clips tab, it's turning, in this case, it turned the file down 3.529 decibels to get it to the level I told it to get to. And that level really doesn't mean anything because it all depends on your effects chain. But for me, this works. But what I like about it is that it's the reason it says pre-gain, that's going to be prior to any clip effects. So real quick, WaveLab has essentially 3 places to insert plugins within the montage. It has clip effects, which means you're putting plugins right on this clip that's highlighted. Track effects, which means you're putting plugins right on track 1 audio track. It has group effects, which we're not going to get into. And then output effects, that's kind of like your master fader of your montage. So 3 main places. There's, of course, the master section, which comes after all that. I'm not going to deal with that today. But my whole point was in the clips tab, this pre-gain means it's happening before clip effects. Post-gain would mean after clip effects, but before any track effects or output effects. So let's get into some effects. In the not too distant past, I would start by putting some plugins on the clip itself. Not my final limiter, but some basic plugins. The reason I like to keep the limiter and any maximizing stuff in the montage output section is because sometimes we have to create an album master or EP out of a bunch of singles. And usually when you're combining a bunch of singles, the limiting and loudness is probably going to change from what you originally had because you're trying to make the album more cohesive. Hopefully not changing much, but I like to separate out the main processing of the song, the EQ, dynamics, any saturation, any de-essing, all that stuff I like to keep in one section. And it was especially handy because if you copy this clip into a new montage to assemble the album, those effects go with it. That's not a bad way to work. You can still do that. What I like to do these days, though, is my first round of effects, I put it on the track now. And the reason for that is when we get to doing the instrumental and extra versions, all those versions are going through the same plugin chain. With the method I just told you, you would have to put the same effects chain on each clip, each version of the song, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it can be hard to remember to update it. Let's say you make a tweak to the main version, and you got to remember to update every other version. You can forget, and it can take a little time and things like that. So now I just put the initial processing on the track. So anything on this track, like I said, the instrumental, all the alternates are going to be lined up on the same track. So that's an easy way to manage it all. The other reason is for external editing purposes. Let's say I'm listening to this song and I hear a click or a pop. I can highlight that section, have it, and I'll do it. I'll show you how to do it. I'm going to highlight this section, send it to my external editor, Spectre Layers, whatever, fix the click or pop, save it, and come back to WaveLab. And this part will be sectioned off into a new clip, which is no big deal. But using track effects is nice because then it's just feeding the track effects. Whereas if I was using clip effects, once this starts to get split up and you want to change the EQ of the song, you have to remember to do it to this section, the split up section, and the part after it. So it gets to be more to manage. So for a few reasons, I've been doing my main, for singles, not for albums, for singles, doing my main effects on the track and then still my limiting, any maximizing on the track output. So I've kind of been skipping clip effects for singles. So what I'm going to do here is, you can click in here and load any plugin that you want. You can do it one by one. Is there an advantage for -16? Not really. I just picked that number one day and then built a plugin chain around that. I think -14 as a starting point is getting a little too loud for some plugins that model analog gear. You can start to overload things like tape machine simulations at -14. -20, nothing wrong with that. It's a little conservative. I just picked -16. And if we go back and look at that, that's -16 top of loudness range. So that means the loudest parts of that song are around -16 LUFS, and probably on average, depends on the song, but if you did the integrated loudness of a particular song, it's probably around maybe -18. So I'm probably starting around -18 integrated, or I like to use this top of loudness range because I think integrated is a bad way to set a lot of things, because if your song's really dynamic, you're going to be way off. What all this does is it looks at the loudest section of the song and sets that to -16. That's really nice for a lot of things, especially albums, because then even if you have some really dynamic songs that start quiet and build up, the loudest parts of all your songs are hitting the same and feeling the same, and that's usually more musical to my ear. So that's why I picked that number. There's nothing scientific about it. It just felt good for the plugins I use for kind of hitting their sweet spot. With a digital EQ, like the fab filter. It honestly doesn't matter because it's floating point, and it doesn't matter how loud or quiet you go into it. I mean, it might matter to your audio interface. It might sound distorted if you're going too hot, and it's, you know, sounds bad coming out of your interface. But from the plugin standpoint, it doesn't matter. It's really about those pieces of gear that model analog equipment. So that's why I picked that number. So let's get back to it. I've got a little off track, but I think we're normalized to a certain level. Yeah, so we can add effects. Again, you could do it right on the clip, which is right on this song. In recent years, I've started doing it on the track now. So you can go one by one and decide what your song needs as far as effects. That's one way of doing it. I have a little plug-in chain that I like to use, and a lot of it is set to not be active, but it's ready to go with some settings that I like. And the compressor that I like to use, it's not really doing any gain reduction, but the output level is of a certain gain that gets me close to my final level. And then my limiter can take me to that final level. Of course, I'm not really going to be teaching mastering so much in this video, just how to use WaveLab to do your mastering work. But if you look at the compressor, you know, it's got some makeup gain, and that's going to, between the normalization I did, the makeup gain, and my final limiter, that's going to get you pretty close to where you might want to be. You know, you're in the ballpark. Of course, you always go a little louder, or it depends on the music, but it gets you very close. It saves you a lot of time and fighting. So this just loads some plugins that I like to use. As you can see, a lot of them are set to flat. It's not doing anything, but some common points that I might like to work at. Things like that. Of course, you can add your own plugins. You can remove plugins if it doesn't need that, or that. You know, all sorts of things you can do here. But that at least gets you started. And if we look here at the loudest meter, I'm in, let's play a little bit louder section. We're hitting -11. So by the time we add a limiter with a few dB of gain, we're in that -9 range, which is for some people loud, for some people quiet. That's where your taste and instinct and directions from the client really come into play. But again, that's gets you in a really nice ballpark. So as you can see, this plugin chain doesn't have a limiter, and maybe, you know, not that you have to use a limiter, but most people do these days. So in the output effects tab, that's where I would maybe add a limiter. Sometimes I've been stacking limiters too I've been finding that instead of trying to use one limiter to get it super loud, sometimes using two limiters, each one doing a little bit less work, is a little cleaner approach. Usually that's just reserved for the stuff where people want it insanely loud. That helps me get it insanely loud without sounding too distorted or too aggressive and things like that. So I have another chain where I can load. This one I think has inflator, Sonic's inflator, which is a cool plugin. Fab filter. People ask me about this a lot, so I'll just stop and talk about it quick. I like to use, you know, the true peak limiting is controversial. I think it can sound bad if you try to do it within your main limiting. So let's say I'm working on this song and I got the EQ right and everything's feeling good. You know, then I can add a little level with the limiter. And now we're getting into that. And I'm just guessing because I can't hear anything. -8 for this louder part. We're getting close. So my ceiling on this is set to -0.5. I think true peak limiting can sound kind of weird if you try to do it in your main limiter. But what I like about the Tokyo Dawn is I got everything turned off except the true peak section, and I have it set there as well. So you can see this meter is going to engage when it's doing anything, which it's not doing anything right now. There's also a delta mode, so you can hear what it's doing. So I think when you split up the duties, it actually is pretty effective, rather than trying to tackle it with one big, you know, in one swing. So that's my 2 cents on true peak limiting. But that's, people ask me why I have that there, and it's really just a safety net set to true peak only. We'd have to listen through the whole song, but it's probably just grabbing a couple little things, and not really, you know, it's not. You know, if I lower the ceiling, then yeah, it's grabbing everything. That's too much. But if we're tasteful and careful, it's a nice little thing there. So that is kind of the whole signal flow here. So back to my other point, let's say I'm mastering, now that it's louder and clearer, I've made it sound so much better. Let's pretend. Let's say I'm hearing a tick or a pop. I could highlight the section. Now I don't have spectral layers installed on this computer. Again, I just haven't had time to learn it. I'm sure I have nothing against it. It's just a time thing. But in your preferences, you have external applications, and I have RX set up as my external editor. So if I highlight it, and this is a shortcut that I programmed, but if I press the period key on the number pad, it opens up RX. And I could, let's say that's a click, I could remove that. Let's say that's a click, I could remove that. Save it, close it. And now we have the fixed section right there in WaveLab. And it's really clean. Even though there's no crossfades, there's no tick or pop there. So it's very sample accurate. And now if I'm listening, that pop is gone. So the problem with clip effects is once you start splitting up your clip, then you have to manage your clip effects separately. So if I would have been using clip effects, sometimes you can get a tick or a pop from using clip effects with no crossfades like this. But now instead of managing one set of effects, I'm managing 3. So for me, that's no good. So that's another reason why for singles I've moved to using, and I'm just going to close this and reopen it because it bothers me when there's empty plugin slots because I removed some. So when you close and reopen it, it clears them. So anyways, now we're just managing for the core tonality of the song, we're just managing one set of plugins, even though it's split up into 3 clips. You can also you can split clips for a spectral repair, spectral editing, but you can also split up clips. Let's say, I mean, we don't do this too often in mastering, but well, let's say this. Let's say this intro is goofy and I want a different EQ than the rest of the song. I could split that up. That's where I probably would want to do a crossfade. Now I can go in the clip effects section and add a plugin just to that intro. Let's say this intro has like a really harsh sound in it. I could dial that down, do anything else. And now, since it's a clip effect, it's only on that intro. So watch what happens as I'm playing through the intro. The activity on this plugin is going to stop because now that section is over with. So that's another good use for clip effects and working this way. And of course, we can level automate, let's say, and I think this client did ask, I forgot what section, but there was one section where they wanted it louder. So we can highlight, or we can section off part of the song and, just make that part louder. All sorts of stuff you can do. And this is all stuff that's hard to do / impossible or just a pain to do if you're trying to do a single song in the audio editor, because there's no volume. Well, there is an envelope line, but I forget where it is because it's so strange. But I just don't care for this view for doing singles. I like to see what's going on better. So that's in a nutshell doing a single song. Let's talk about reference tracks. So as I mentioned, the client sent me their reference version. Now this is where, so the reference version is a sample rate of 40. Oh, it is 96. This is where WaveLab will resample it if it's not the same sample rate as your Montage. And I think for this purpose, it's okay. So I'm going to load that in. If it wasn't the same sample rate, I would have converted it and made a data folder. So you kind of got to line it up, get it in sync. But this is where I could be listening to what I'm doing. I did a whole episode on video on reference tracks. So you may want to watch that if you're not sure what reference tracks are. But I know you can't hear any audio, and neither can I. But I'm not hearing the reference track right now. It's not, if you did this in Pro Tools or Cubase, you'd be hearing both tracks playing at the same time, and it'd be really distorted and sound terrible and not be what you want. The beauty of the reference track with the little R here is that it's to hear it, I have to either solo it, and now I'm hearing just the reference track, but better yet, I'm not hearing it through any plugins whatsoever. Even though that's moving, that's for the other track, but it bypasses all the plugins, so you're hearing just the reference track of how they're sounded. That's another thing that's challenging in mixing DAWs. You don't really have reference tracks to A/B stuff like this. And as mentioned, I have it routed to my monitor controller, so I can actually just press a button on the monitor controller and compare it that way if you prefer to do that. It's really a personal preference. So that is one way to do it. I'm going to undo some of these edits because it's something I normally would have done earlier if I was thinking ahead. So just don't pay attention to what I'm doing here. Let's just say this is one normal clip again. Great. The other thing you can do, and part of why I have this reference track as part of my template, is you can right-click on the track header. You can copy clips to another track. In this case, I'm going to copy it to track 2, the reference track. And this is a cool menu because you can choose to copy the plugins, copy the envelopes for volume and panning, copy the gain. In this case, I don't want to copy anything. I just want to press OK because I want the original, untouched, unmastered mix to be on this track, because now I'm comparing, my work to their unmastered mix. Sometimes you want to do that. And you can have multiple reference tracks. I could make another reference track. One of them could have their loud version. And that's why I have 2 paths set up here, really. For my monitor controller, reference 1 could be their unmastered mix untouched. Reference 2 could be that loud reference version from the mix engineer, and you can toggle them all on your monitor controller or manually in WaveLab. So I just wanted to show the reference track thing because it's pretty handy, just to copy it down without any effects, without any gain changes, just pure, you're hearing the unmastered mix. So let's say I'm happy with how this sounds. You're probably wondering, well, now what? I'm going to do a whole episode on rendering very soon. But let's say I'm happy with this. I need to render it out. Now, you probably noticed that I didn't do any dithering yet. And that's because of, I like to do this rendering practice, whether it's an EP, an album, or a single. I like to have kind of one workflow that works for everything. It might not be the most efficient thing to do for a given project, but if you're a busy mastering engineer, you kind of want to just have it groove in a workflow that covers all the bases. You're not going to paint yourself into a corner. So that's kind of why I do things the way I do it. I like to deliver a lot of files for the client to work with because I have no idea if they're going to use a distributor that can accept a 96K file, or if they're using CD Baby, which unfortunately only accepts 16-bit 44.1 files. A lot of clients like to get an MP3 anyways, just for reference to email to their friend or family members or promo. So this covers all those bases, and this, I think, is the smartest way to do it. So there's no dithering yet because I'm going to render a floating point wave to lock all this in. So let's go to the render tab. I have render presets. I always use this one first, initial montage render. And the render presets are just really great. It sets up all these settings for you. The source that we're rendering, all this stuff can be saved as a render preset. So that's the first thing I do. The second thing I do is create the folder in which this first file is going to be rendered to. And I go into the project and I call it 96K renders. And now we have to give it a name. So again, this is why it's great to have a good folder structure, because I can just copy the band name. Don't ask me why, but I like to make sure there's no spaces in these particular files. It helps me differentiate, helps make sure there's no illegal characters or anything. You don't want to have a space. If you have a space at the end of your file name, certain programs might not like that. So I'm going to render this because it's the band name, the song name, version 1, going to 96K renders folder. It's a 64-bit floating file. These are options that were set with my render preset, but you can take a peek at them. The main thing here is create audio montage from result, because here's what's going to happen. Let's see how slow this goes. Not too bad. I think I can talk through this. So this is rendering, and what's going to happen here is it's going to create a new montage with all the plugin processing baked in, and from there I'm going to work my way down to 44.1. When it comes to singles, I deliver 5 files. I deliver the 24-bit high sample rate, which for me is usually 96K. I deliver a 24-bit 48K wave because a lot of times singles, somebody makes a video for singles, and kind of I would say the standard for video editors is 48K. There's a lot more, it's a lot more complicated than that when you get into YouTube encoding and stuff like that. But basically, your video editor person is probably going to have their audio set to 48K. So if you can hand them a 48K wave, that means it's less conversions that somebody's doing outside of the mastering studio, which can sound terrible. I've seen too many videos get ruined. The audio gets ruined by the video editor. No offense, video editors. So I deliver the 48K version. I deliver a 24-bit 44.1 version for those that want that format. I deliver a 16-bit 44.1 version, like I mentioned, for CD Baby, because that's a particular distributor that refuses to accept high-resolution files other than for Apple Digital Masters. And then I also make MP3, so that's 5 files. So this just rendered. So that's my plugin processing baked in. As you can see, all the CD text and metadata carried over. The markers carried over. It's basically my montage, but with the plugins baked in. And I have a little Stream Deck command here that's going to copy the name of the source montage, and it's going to rename this montage basically the same thing, but it's going to change the 6496 to 2496 and save it for me. And it's going to ask me, hey, you should put a dither plugin in there now. So I'm going to load my dither preset. Good hertz, good dither. WaveLab 11 came with a good dither as well. I just haven't gotten in the habit of using it, but I forget the name of it now. But it's in here somewhere. WaveLab comes with a great dithering plugin now. I just haven't worked it into my workflow. Yeah, Lin Dither. So you could use this. This comes with WaveLab. So anyways, so now we have our montage. It's named this now. This montage file is saved right next to the file that it needs. And from here, I can render a WAV file at 24-bit 96K. So now I go to my render presets. And this can happen so much faster when you're not talking about it. So render presets, I press the number 9. It brings up basically this naming scheme because it's going to add this to the end of the file name. Now, before I render these files, I want to make a folder for them all. So again, another advantage to having a naming structure is I can copy this name that I came up with in the previous montage. I can paste it in here. Now the highlighted section, that's going to be my folder that I deliver to the client. And that has a pretty good name, if you ask me. It has the band name, the song name, the version number, and then the files are going to be in it. So I'm going to render that. And you can see it went quickly because the only plugin processing it had to do was dithering. And now if we go to this folder, I got 1 file in there already. So again, this all goes pretty quickly once you get in a flow. So I'm going to go back. I'm not going to convert that file I just rendered. I'm going to go 2 steps back. I'm going to convert that initial floating point render with all the plugins baked in. I'm going to load that into, you could do this in WaveLab with the batch processor. Again, I'm just stuck in my ways. But I'm going to create a 48K renders folder and downsample that floating point 96 version down to floating point 48. I don't do any dithering yet, so you can see the source file is 64, and it's staying floating point. And then I'm going to repeat that step for the 44.1 version. And this helps me create all my deliverables. I don't like to do too much batch processing on the deliverables because I like to have control and check things along the way. And I'll show you what I mean by that. But now, oh yeah, let me slow down here. So to recreate this montage at 48K, there's a feature called Custom Montage Duplicate. So you go to new, custom, or you go to new from current file, duplicate, customize duplicate. So this is what I'm choosing. That's the slow way. The fast way is to program some shortcuts. The Stream Deck thing I have, what it's doing is copying the Montage name because that comes in handy. Then bringing up this window because this is the customized duplicate window. It's saying where is the file you want to use to create the new montage. So you navigate to that folder. In this case, it's the 48K folder because we're working our way down here. Now you can see that it created a new montage. Everything's in place. Marker names same. The only difference is the montage is 48K. So when I press Command S to save it, I paste in that name that I copied a few steps ago and change it to 2448 version 1. My dithering is still there. So this is where you could analyze and check to see if any peaks occurred from the resampling, and then decide if you want to add another safety limiter just to catch any peaks or just let them fly. In this case, my ceiling was low enough and I wasn't pushing the song super loud that there's no peaks to worry about. But this is where you can analyze your peaks after sample rate conversion and decide. Now, if there were any stray peaks that I was concerned about, I have a little plug-in chain preset here that does this. It again loads that Tokyo Dawn True Peak limiter. Ceiling set to minus 0.1. That means it's going to be doing basically nothing except catching any really stray peaks that occurred from the sample rate conversion. So it's not touching. And you can again check by the delta listen and the meter. It does very little, but if you're concerned about it not showing up as peaks, you can use that. We don't need to use it in this particular project, so I'm going to flip back to just dithering. And again, now I can open the presets tab and press the number 8. It sets everything how I want it to, but adds 2448 to the file name. And this is where I can start to go pretty quickly. Going to repeat the steps to create a 44.1 montage. Our dither is already there. I could analyze again to see if this particular conversion added any peaks. Did not. Close that. Again, open the presets, press the letter I. It happens to be. So for those that don't know, if you look in your menus, if there's an underlined character, that means that's the shortcut. And in this case, we're doing this version, so I can press the I and it turns it to that. And I'll show you what's going on. Now we need to make a 16-bit 44.1 version. So I do save as, which is Shift and S. Just rename it like that. Everything's always saved in the correct folder. I have a preset for 16-bit dithering. I could just manually change the dither plugin, or I could just load my preset, same difference. Now I'm opening the preset menu and pressing 6. And the MP3. Now, we haven't talked about artwork yet. I tend to not put artwork in the waves because many programs can't display the artwork in WAV files anyway. And there could be cases where artwork in the WAV files does cause an issue with the distributor. It could trigger an error message. So unless the client really requests artwork in the WAV files, I don't put it in there because it can cause more problems than it solves. And again, a lot of programs, Mac OS is starting to be able to show artwork in waves, but as of not that long ago, it could only show artwork in AIFFs and not waves. Long story short, I only put the art in the MP3s unless the client asks for it in the waves. To put the artwork in, the slow way would be to go to the metadata tab and press edit and go to the picture tab and press this plus button. My key command is just to press Shift A to bring up this window, and I can press the plus button. Now it's asking me for artwork, and it's not in my pictures folder, unfortunately. This is generic artwork kind of, but you want to make sure your image is a JPEG or PNG. And actually, this is a good example. We don't want to put a 4 megabyte, almost 5 megabyte artwork file in the MP3 because that's going to be probably bigger than the MP3 audio itself. So let me open this. This is what I usually do. Adjust size. I can change it to 1200 square. We're not graphic artists here. We're just trying to put it gets it, maybe I should have chose 900. In a perfect world, I'd go back and just do one change, but in the essence of time, we're going to change that. And now I like to get the artwork between, under 1 megabyte. Still can look good. Graphic artists are probably cringing, but we're just doing this for the MP3. It's nothing official that's going to go on streaming or packaging. So now we're going to add this artwork. But my whole point was you want to be careful of the artwork size, because you'll get artwork files that are 20 or 30 megabytes, which is good for other things, not good for embedding in your MP3s. So now you can see the artwork is there. When I like to render, I have MP3, and I know I was going a little fast, but this is what I was doing. I was doing 2496 single. I was choosing all these options. Whereas when I'm doing albums, I choose 24-bit or 16-bit tracks. There's a difference, and I'll try to explain that. But I'm going to choose MP3 single and render that. So now what we have here is a nice folder of 5 versions. We have, from top to bottom here, we have our 16-bit 44.1, and as you can see, there's metadata in the file. We have our 24-bit 44.1, we have our 24-bit 48, we have our high-res 24-bit 96, and we have a reference MP3 with artwork. So that's what I deliver to clients. Now, the way we deliver it, that's a whole other topic, but that is how you get, in my opinion, a nice... Yeah, I usually like to keep the artwork under 1 megabyte. There's no rule to that, but I've had media players that won't display the artwork if you accidentally use a huge file. And again, if you use a huge artwork file, it's going to make the MP3 huge. So you want to be careful with the art that you're adding. WaveLab doesn't really convert any art for you. It just adds what you tell it to add. So this covers all the bases for the digital, the single song master of this particular song. We have any format the client could need, and we can send them this folder and explain what is what. Some people might think this is over delivering. If you're mastering busy every day, you don't have time to ask your client, what distributor do you use? And, you just want to give them everything they need and a nice email template so they know what everything is and they're not confused. And you usually make them happy and you don't hear back from them with any questions, or they don't need a different format because they use this distributor and this and that and the other thing. So that's how I do singles. We're getting close to the end here, but I do want to touch on maybe doing an instrumental version and a revision. I'll do the revision first. So I'm going to close everything. Let's say the client says, we love it, but can you make it? No, let's say the client says, we love it, but we had to send you a new mix because the backing vocals were muted. Believe it or not, that's happened to me. I've mastered a song and they said we love it, but the backing vocals are muted. Okay, well, we got to redo. It's especially annoying when you use analog gear and you did a lot of spectral edits to remove clicks and pops, because all that has to be redone in real time. Even though a lot of your settings are saved, there's still a lot of manual redo work, plus rendering, plus file management. So it's not a 2-minute fix, unfortunately. So let's say we love it, but we goofed up and here's a new mix file, and we only, sometimes it's the smallest change. Sometimes it's a big change and then you have to adjust your settings. Like, oh, we turned the bass guitar way up, or we turned the bass guitar way down, or we made the vocals louder. Then you have to kind of, aside from loading in the file, rethink some of your processing decisions. Let's say this is a really simple change where let's say it's even simpler. They retuned some vocal lines. Everything else is the same. And let's say I downloaded that mix and upsampled it, and I'm just going to make a duplicate because we're pretending here. But let's say this is mix version 8. So they said, we love what you did. Can you just use this new version? The online player I use is called Samply. If you go to samply.app, it's a cool thing because it's gapless and lossless, and you can add the artwork, and it shows you the metadata instead of the file names. It's designed with a lot of help from mastering engineers. So if you want a good mastering approval player, samply.app. It's especially great for EPs and albums because it plays the songs in order with no gap or tick or pop between songs. It goes to the next song even if your phone display is asleep. It basically works like a streaming service, but it's lossless. Looks great. I've been using it for almost 2 years now, helping them out, and it's really helped my approval process because if you just send someone a Dropbox link, they're going to stream it from Dropbox. It's going to sound terrible. It's going to have artifacts. Chaos is going to ensue. So Samply is, I think, a great tool for mastering and mix engineers, but the presentation that it gives of the album is, you can't beat it because it looks just like a nice streaming service with the artwork, clean titles, not ugly file names. It's great. Samply.app. So let's say we got a new mix with some tuned vocals. What I do is Shift S for save as. I change the version 1. I changed the version 1 to a version 2 and hit save. Now again, this little underscore to me indicates that that's the master montage, because as you can see, we have a little bit of a mess here with all these variations. It's hard to see what's the master, but the little underscore sticks out pretty easily. So that's how I know if I have to like reopen something when I'm on something else. So version 2. And what you can do in WaveLab is the shortcut for me is Command R for replace, but you can go to insert, replace audio file. I don't do it the slow way very often, so browse, open file selector. I was already there. You can point it to the new file, so we'll go to mix version 8, and it pops in the new mix version, and then all your plugins, all your edits, everything is the same. So that really makes it a little less painless when they send a new mix version, because you don't have to redo your plugins or your edits or your automation points, assuming the new mix file is in sync. So that's what I do when I get a new mix file. Or even if they say, we love the master, but can you just make it louder? I still do the save as version 2, and then I do my changes. So that's how you do a revision if they send you a new file. If they said, hey, can you make it louder too? Then I can do I could crank up the limiter to crazier level, do my changes, and I just repeat the steps. Trying to think if there's a single that I've done 2 versions of here. I just kind of cleared off my drive of finished projects, so there might not be anything. No, there's not. I just kind of cleaned everything up. So, well, maybe. Anyway, I would just repeat the steps, and then I end up with a folder called, I would end up with a folder called exactly this, but version 2. Duplicate, and then it would say version 2 at the end of it. And then sometimes what I'll do is, you don't want your client to have files that have the same name, so sometimes I'll highlight them. There's a great program called Better Finder Rename, and I can just right click on it in there and choose that preset, and now it puts version 2 at the end of the file names. You can also do that in WaveLab with the render presets, but it gets a little complicated. So you have a V1 and a V2 down here, but it wipes out the other one. So I find it faster to just do it with the right click in a Better Finder Rename app really fast. Then your client isn't sitting there with 2 files with the same name on their hard drive, wondering which is which version. So real quickly, I want to touch on instrumentals, and that'll apply to alternate version. You could have, I do some singles where there's 4 or 5 versions of the song because there's many variations of the mix. Not so much vocal up and down, but TV mix, clean mix, no DJ, all sorts of goofy stuff. So yeah, let's start over and pretend that I'm doing a different single, but the main instrumental, and a lot of the same things apply. I'm going to start my montage from a template. I'm going to load in. Most of this is going to be how to keep the files the same length and things like that. So I'm going to load in, V8. We'll ignore that because that didn't happen yet. So I'm going to load in both files. And I don't want the instrumental first. I mean, there's really no rules, but I want the main version to be first and then the instrumental. Some of these features are more useful for albums, but I'm going to choose tracks, line up files on active track. And now we got something that looks like that. And I'm going to have to come up with a new name so it doesn't repeat. But Linger Long, we'll call it Linger Longer. So, and as you can see, this mix engineer was great because the length of each version is exactly the same. You don't always get that, but when you do it, you appreciate it. So back to my original thing, we want to add the right amount of buffer. Now, one thing that some people don't know about is you can select more than one clip in WaveLab, and you can hold the Option key. I'm on a Mac, as you can see. If I do that and hold Option, the edits are mirrored to all the versions. So if I shorten the file or add a fade, if you hold Option and they're all selected, then you can do more than 2. You can do 4 or 5, whatever. Your edits are mirrored. So even though I've trimmed this, I wouldn't do this. But if we go to the Clips tab, I gotta refresh it. You can see the clips are still the same length. So that's great for when you're doing multiple versions of a song. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make the downbeat again be at 200 milliseconds for the first, for the main version. And, well, I guess the other thing we could do is we could trim up this end now. I might as well get that over with. Let's say I'm listening and I decide that that's the perfect fade out. Now, you kind of have to trust the process, but if both clips are selected, I'm holding Option. This trimming and fade out is going to happen to both clips. And as you can see, they're still the same length. But the reason I did that is I want to pretend that's the ideal ending. Now in the pre-gap section, 7, you can see there's all this space here. We don't want that. 7 seconds and 941 milliseconds is no good, but we could change it to 0 seconds and 200 milliseconds. I use the Clips tab a lot, especially when the client's in an album and the client says, can you add 2 seconds between this song and that song? You can, of course, eyeball it and drag it, but you can also just type it in and it's just precise and faster. So, because what we're going to do here when I make markers, it's going to, of course, make a marker at 0 for the main version, and it's going to make a marker for the other version. The marker for the instrumental is going to end up right here. So we're going to end up with the instrumental and the main are going to be the same length, and I'll show you how that's done. How do you put metadata into a WAV file where it stretches across the board on all file formats? I'm not sure I understand the question, but if you follow what I just did, you can see that all my WAV files and the MP3 all have the same metadata, with the exception of the artwork, which I purposely did not put in the WAV files. But if you open this in the applications such as, say, Meta, you can see that they all have the same metadata. And I could do more. I could put composer and genre, but WaveLab will do it. You don't need a separate app. I'm going to get back to this. I'm going to, again, use the CD wizard. And again, in my single song template, which is different from the album, it's going to have these settings and no quantize, which is good for singles. So just made markers. And the bad thing about that, there's no way around it, but you can see the first marker is not it puts the markers at the start of each clip. So the way to fix that is go to the markers tab and choose move multiple markers, which I have a shortcut as tab and the letter M. And we just need to make sure we're choosing no quantize. So I have 2 presets. One quantizes, one doesn't, but they both move the markers backwards 200 milliseconds, except it doesn't move the end markers. We wouldn't want that to happen, but it moves these 2 types of markers. Press OK. And now if you check out the markers tab, my 2 tracks are still the same exact length down to the millisecond, but you can see we got this little buffer of time before the downbeat. And 200 milliseconds is not a standard. It's just something that I think works. So that's kind of the main thing I wanted to show you with doing instrumentals and alternate versions is you can line them up in your montage. And if you're careful with the editing and the marker placement, you can end up with tracks that are the same length, whether it's 2 versions or 5 or 10. The CD wizard stuff is very similar. I would still do this process. Depending on how you work, your files may or may not already have the correct name, because I'm in the box. It's grabbing the file names, which are rarely perfect. There's always some extra stuff involved or not correct. So with the track 2, I have a little shortcut to add the word instrumental after it. It actually adds, if you look closely, it adds a blank space and then instrumental. And then, again, I can press Option R, and now you'll notice the marker name changed to that as well. So everything's cleaned up. And then kind of from here, I can just repeat the same steps I showed you and this is really where, I could use clip effects to dial in this song, but then you have to really make sure you copy all the clip effects to the other versions. And trust me, it's easy to forget when you're in a hurry. So that's really why I reverted to track effects and montage effects, because now, my instrumental, my TV mix, my acapella, it's all going to get the same processing. Even if I make a quick EQ tweak, I don't have to do it to every clip. So that's kind of why I've been doing that for singles. For albums, I still use clip effects because it's just more conducive to that workflow. But then from there, I would just repeat the rendering steps that I showed you. Trying to think if there's any differences. No, let me see if I did an instrumental for somebody, this band. So in this case, I just end up with the song folder like I told you about, and then I like to split up the main and instrumental. They could all go in the same folder too, but that's kind of what you end up with. So if there's any questions, let me know. I'm going to check my notes and make sure I covered everything, just because we're getting a little long here. I'm going to do a whole video just on the various rendering options, but and the other thing that someone asked is, a lot of times we end up mastering a single and then it has to be turned into an album with a bunch of other songs. And I just did that last night. So what I did is I opened up all the single montages and just copied each song into the new montage for the EP. And the reason I did that is because then I know that any volume changes that I had, level automation is going to match the single version that they already approved. And then I had to manually transfer all the the plugins for each song to each clip. So it's a little bit of work, but I'll probably have to do a whole episode on maybe that too, because I could go on for another hour about that. But if there are any questions, I'm watching the chat. Hopefully I didn't miss any during the live stream. If you have any questions, you can head over to the WaveLab users Facebook group. I know not everyone's on Facebook, so there's also the WaveLab forum on the Steinberg website, which is a great resource because PG, who is the developer and creator of WaveLab, he's over there. He'll answer your questions directly if you have a problem or request. So the WaveLab forum on Steinberg's website is great for that. WaveLabHelp.com has all my settings and all these videos and a bunch of information. The WaveLab users group on Facebook, like I mentioned, that's a good place to have more of a casual conversation about how to do something. Not a great place to report bugs because no one's going to see that. I mean, I'll see it, but if you have a bug or a feature request, that's better to do on the forum because that'll go directly to Steinberg. The Facebook group is more for just asking questions and chatting with other WaveLab users and to be aware of updates and promotions and things like that. So that's kind of the three places: Facebook group, Steinberg, WaveLab forum, WaveLabHelp.com. If you're watching this soon or live or soon after, don't forget about the promotion for SpectraLayers Pro and WaveLab Pro. It's only $4.99 for both programs, which is kind of like getting one of them for free. Super good value. I use WaveLab every day, all day for mastering because, while you can do some of the processing, you can do a lot of this stuff in any DAW. WaveLab really streamlines it for mastering specifically. So I could go on about that, but we'll have to save that for another time. Thanks for tuning in to these. We'll do another one next month and every month after that. And if you have any questions, we'll see you on the Facebook group or the WaveLab forum, or maybe back here next month for the next live stream. So until then, take care.